So we've got a classmate out, so that explains for Zoom for him today. Any questions, comments, concerns about anything before we get going? Everything's good. All right, so I figured since we've been focusing so much on social tableau and historical context, that today I would focus primarily on the meaning of ads, the process of making ads, and then we'll conclude with going over a bit on the process of creating your next assignments, which are ultimately building up towards getting your paper in on April 28th. So to begin, we'll start with like, what do ads mean? How do we know what ads mean? What do we think we know ads mean? Earlier in the semester, one of you in your writing assignments mentioned semiotics, which I thought was really impressive. So we're getting into semiotics now. So the definition of semiotics is the study of systems of signs. This is coined by Ferdinand de Saussure. He's a Swiss Frenchman, I should say Swiss, who also speaks French. And he basically boils it down to the sign equals the signifier and the signified. So this is de Saussure. So in this one, Superman is the signifier and milk is the signified. So what do you associate with Superman normally? Go ahead.
Strength and power.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what milk's trying to tell you here. This is like a popular Got Milk campaign from about 10 years ago. And that's exactly what that's saying, like milk will make you strong like Superman, essentially. So again, Superman is the signifier, milk is the signified. So whenever you're looking at ads throughout the course of the semester, I want you to be conscious of like, what's the signifier, what's the signified. So a good example of semiotics is this painting Las Meninas. Has anyone seen this painting? I think it's in Madrid, at a museum in Madrid. But when you look at it at first glance, it doesn't really seem like there's too much going on. But I think this TED Ed video, just 3.5 minutes long, does a good job of showing you how much meaning is actually embedded in this.
Great protection and great low rates you want? Yep. Click for a great auto rate today.
When I was a student, I'd write long essays that I'd work on for days, but now I'm ready.
On first glance, this painting might not seem terribly special, but it's actually one of the most analyzed paintings in the history of art. It's called Las Meninas, or The Maids of Honor, painted by Diego Velázquez in 1656, and it depicts a scene in the life of the Spanish royal court. A well-dressed child princess refuses a glass of water from a handmaid, while a dwarf teases a dog. A second dwarf stands next to them, while the artist himself pauses at his canvas. Two more people whisper in the background, while a third appears to be exiting the room. And why wouldn't he when there seems to be so little going on? Even the dog looks bored. But look more closely. The two people reflected in the blurry mirror at the back, easily missed at first glance, are none other than King Philip IV and Queen Mariana, seemingly changing the scene from a simple depiction of court life to that of a royal portrait. And with this piece of information, we can begin to understand far more about the painting and why it has captivated viewers for centuries. First, there is the historical context. When Las Meninas was painted at the end of Philip's reign, the Spanish Empire was in a period of decline, having suffered defeat in the 30 Years' War, as well as economic and political difficulties. The king himself had also suffered misfortune, losing both his first wife and his only heir to the throne before remarrying. But the painting obscures their struggle to provide food for their household. Even the monarch's advanced age is concealed through the blurring of the mirror. What we do see in the geometric center of the canvas, brightly illuminated by the light from the window, is the Infanta Margarita Teresa, the king's only living legitimate child at the time. Her glowing and healthy appearance is an idealized view of the struggling empire's future. However, the Infanta is not the only center of the painting. Through the clever use of perspective, as well as painting the work life-sized on a 10.5 by 9-foot canvas, Velázquez blurs the boundary between art and reality. creating the sense of a three-dimensional picture that we can walk into. The line between the ceiling and the wall converges to the open door, further creating the perception of the painting as a physical space, seen from the viewer's perspective. In this sense, the audience and the real world are the focus, underlined by the three figures looking straight at the viewer. But there is still another focal point. The line formed by the light fixtures leads to the center of the back wall, to the mirror reflecting the royal couple. And its positioning relative to the viewer has led to radically different interpretations of the entire work. The mirror could be reflecting the king and queen posing for their portrait, or is it reflecting the canvas? And what do we make of the fact that Velázquez never painted the royal portrait implied here? Could the painting actually be depicting its own creation instead? With the incorporation of the mirror into his work, Velázquez elevated the art of painting from its perception as a simple craft to an intellectual endeavor. With its three competing center points, Las Meninas captures the contrast between the ideal, the real, and the reflected worlds, maintaining an unresolved tension between them to tell a more complex story than any mirror can provide.
So I mean, ads serve a similar function between like the ideal, real, and reflected world. So, so who would be the signified and what would be the signifier in this? Yeah.
It would be the model and the clone.
Right. So what's the model like sort of imbuing in the clone?
I
Go ahead.
guess.
Oh, go ahead.
I
Howard.
hear you.
Thank you for talking. A sense, I guess, a sense of attractiveness, like it makes you look good, like if you look good, you look good if you smell good, type of thing.
Yeah, that's part of it. What were you gonna say, Howard?
Mostly the same thing.
Yeah, anyone else wants to sort of like add to it, sort of like expand on the idea of it? Troy, what do you think? Like what class would you say he belongs to? Yeah, so upper class, so like that's what's being imbued in the clone too, right? Like, so this guy would say like, go to, you know, a crab bake at the Hamptons, right? So this would be sort of like what's being signified with that sort of like higher class. And of course, beauty, the two of which are often associated together. So the woman who really sort of is at the forefront of applying semiotics to advertisements in particular is Judith Williams. She comes out with this book, Decoding Advertisements, Ideology and Meaning in Advertisements. It's published in 1978. She really takes a deep dive into sort of like trying to tease out what you know, these ads are all about, what they mean. And she establishes 3 theoretical points in her book. She argues that ads are ideological. Ads borrow reference systems from the outside world of ads, such as science, religion, history, literature, and rework them, much like Las Meninas did. And the ideological power of an ad is diminished if the viewer is able to decode, deconstruct, or understand how they work. I think part of the reason for taking a class like this is that it sort of empowers you to sort of like take the power out of the advertisements that might manipulate or influence you. So an ad that's deeply imbued with ideological meaning is the Super Bowl ad for Apple that came out in 1984. So I'll show that to you and then we'll talk about the ideological meaning in it.
Secure from the pest. We are one people. One resolve. One cause. Sounds like
January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
In case you're wondering, I wasn't in that ad. So anyway, what's the ad signifying? Like, what's it sort of like referencing? Go ahead.
1984 by George Orwell.
Yeah, good. So like, what's some themes or tropes that are in Orwell's 1984?
Just the idea that I guess that machines will take over and like Big Brother is watching.
Yeah, exactly. Did you want to add anything?
Like authoritarianism, kind of like, sort of like authority, like that sort of 1984 is about like this totalitarian state.
Yeah, yeah, like the dehumanization associated with totalitarianism. Good. So Apple is. Do you guys know who Apple's sort of like main competitor is? Like who it's comparing itself to during this time period in particular? Like who was like the #1 computer company during this time era? Yeah, so IBM. Here's Steve Jobs in front of IBM's office at the time. IBM from the 1930s through the 20th century is one of the biggest companies in the country. You know, some might argue a monopoly. And Steve Jobs seeks to sort of define Apple as being the antithesis of IBM. IBM is called Big Blue, so it's, you know, it's associated with these guys in blue suits who go around the country selling their products. And so how during this time period, do you know, like just sort of like what you glean from that ads is Apple trying to like brand itself according to? Go ahead.
Like, I would assume just from like the fact that it looked like from the way it was that Apple's supposed to be like, we're gonna set you free from this controlling everyone same type of thing.
Yeah, good. So in that commercial, who was Big Brother? I'll give you a hint. Yeah, right. So and not only that, I don't know if you know anything about Steve Jobs, but he was, you know, very sort of entwined into consumer, or not consumer culture, but counterculture. So he was, you know, a huge fan of Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Grateful Dead, things like that. So when they're starting out, they're really seeking to identify as being the antidote to the sort of like monopoly power, dehumanization of IBM. So I want to show you this quick Charlie Chaplin just segment from Modern Times, which is a movie that came out in 1936. Anybody know anything about Chaplin? Like, why is he so famous in American culture, or Western culture in particular? Nobody's seen a Charlie Chaplin film? God.
It was silent films, right? They're like comedies and they were short, they're pretty short in comparison to normal TV shows. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, usually. So like, so anybody know how he was like commonly portrayed in his movies? Like what class?
Like lower class, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty low class, like-
Yeah, he was like a hero of the working class. Like his most famous character was the Little Tramp. In this, he plays a factory worker. So all his shtick, so to speak, is sort of like a critique of modern industrialized capitalist society. So he doesn't say anything in this, but I want you to sort of be thinking about like what he's actually saying, even though he's not saying anything.
Attention forward. Someone on page 5, check number left paper. On page 5, attention forward. Really fantastic. Really fantastic. Hey! Quit stalling, get back to work. Go on. Section 5, leave it alone.
All right, so what's he basically saying, Chaplain, in this? Go ahead. It's like that.
So I think he's just saying how they overwork workers and they basically become like a machine, like they can't stop because if they stop, then they fall behind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, anyone want to add to it? So like Chaplin's basically being portrayed as like being a cog in a machine, sort of like, so again, you get this sort of like dehumanization that Steve Jobs and Apple are trying to associate with IBM, right? You sort of see this in this Chaplin commercial. Did anyone get any like Big Brother type vibes from this one? Go ahead. Yeah, exactly. So again, this comes out in 1936, right? Orwell's book comes out in 1948, but there's already this sort of like ethos of like Big Brother's watching you that's very much embedded in like, American consumer culture, as well as, Orwell's critique of the Soviet Union. IBM has this really clever campaign where they basically reappropriate Chaplin's shtick and sort of like use it to sell IBM. So I'll just share that to you really quick.
In this rapidly changing world, even the brightest and best manager in the company to run a smooth operation. For when headquarters close, it becomes harder to keep things rolling without running into mix-ups, losing control of the operation, and falling behind. For rapid improvement, a manager could use a tool for modern times, the IBM personal computer, for smoother scheduling, better planning, and greater productivity. It can help a manager excel and become a big wheel in the company. The IBM personal computer. See it at a store near you.
All right, so what's IBM selling you besides their computer? Yeah.
Efficiency.
Yeah, good. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Like success in your company.
Yeah. Anything else? Go ahead.
I guess better teamwork just overall.
Yeah. So, go ahead, Laszlo.
Like progress.
Yep, good.
Organization.
Organization, yep. Anyone else? So, Laszlo, what makes you say progress?
Cause like it's a new way to keep organized and like set like just like to organize their factory and like get stuff done.
Yeah, to make the workday flow more smoothly, right?
Yeah.
Is there like a dehumanization or humanization that's being portrayed in this?
I would say that it's like they try to make it seem like more, I wouldn't say dehumanized, like they try to make it more like humanization, like because from like the factory, the vibe was like very like flowing, like everyone was happy after they had the one computer in the whole factory.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this whole notion when computers like first come on the market in the 30s, like all the way through the 80s, when they start showing up in people's homes, that like computers are something to be like worried about or scared of, like they're replacing humans, automation's happening, which is replacing, factory workers' jobs, things like that. So there's a real like reticence towards computers. So I think this ad in particular does a really good job of sort of like taking the fear out of computers. It's trying to convince you that like computers won't make you less human. They're going to help you be like a more productive, like better human. Did anyone pick up like the wheel motif in it? Did that mean anything to anyone? Like the wheels on the roller skates, Chaplin's character is like the big wheel at the company. Does the wheel mean anything to you in terms of like, ancient history, world history, anything like that? Go ahead. Yeah, it's one of like the world's like most, important innovations in terms of, causing humans to evolve from an agricultural society to an industrial society, of course, railroads, cars, all of that run on wheels. So, I think what's clever about it is that I think IBM is trying to imbue their computers, like reinventing the wheel of sorts, right? Like sort of like an update to what the wheel did for human history, IBM's computers will do for human history as well. So again, like think about this in terms of semiotics, there's all of this hidden meaning in these advertisements. All right, so The ideological transformation in Chaplin's Modern Times, he lampoons industrialization, i.e. capitalism, as soul-stealing, mechanized, dehumanizing. IBM co-ops Chaplin's shtick to portray the notion that their computers restore order and humanity to work/capitalism and do for humans what the wheel did in ancient times. So that's the sort of like ideological takeaway from that ad. So obviously there's two competing stories, or complementary stories, I guess you could say, as well, between IBM's ads and Apple's ads, both of which came out just within months of each other as well. So again, Apple's trying to portray IBM as sort of like big brother, this dehumanizing force, and IBM is actively trying to like work against that image that's being imbued on them by Apple. So again, just nutshell, Apple challenges IBM's dehumanizing monopoly. IBM makes work, capitalism, life, seeming human, and their computers make you more human, not less human. So what about Apple's famous logo? Laszlo, did you want to?
I just want to ask, those two ads they were from the same time period?
Yeah, from like just a couple months between each other they came out. So it was like they were sort of like call and response in some way. So what about Apple's famous logo? Is there a story or any sort of like semiotic meaning that you can derive from it? Yeah.
This might be a stretch, but I kind of get the fact that they're like, they see IBM as like super serious, and by being like colorful, they're trying to show that they're not trying to be like the scary like big brother company.
No, I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, like, what color do you associate with IBM? Anybody know? Go ahead.
Isn't it dark blue? Couldn't you say that?
Yeah, I mean, like they are considered big blue. It's like sort of like IBM is like, colloquially known as big blue. So what do you associate with like blue? Like if you're feeling blue, how are you feeling? Go ahead.
Luminous, sad.
Yeah, and like if you could associate blue with cold, right? Sort of like impersonal. So like what would you read into like all of the rainbow colors then in the ad, in contrast to like big blue of IBM?
It's more fun and interesting, but it's not as like intimidating.
Yeah. I mean, what about like in terms of like human identity? Go ahead, Parker.
Well, I was gonna say like a rainbow
Yeah.
is associated with like happiness and sunshine, whereas like blue is like cold.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Howard.
Oh, like you like touch everybody in a sense, like it's not just put on to like one type of person.
Yeah, good. I think that's part of it. See, something in the last class said, which I hadn't thought of, but I think it was, a pretty interesting point, is that there's like all of these different layers and depths to like sort of human identity, and like Apple is like through their color scheme trying to portray that like there's a sort of like deeper level of like humanness or humanity, I guess, that like they can tap into with their computers. Go ahead, Julie.
In the Apple ad that you showed us before, it was pretty dark, except the girl who threw the hammer was in the searching color.
Yeah.
She was supposed to represent Apple.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I thought to myself like, oh, that's like clearly trying to like the Olympics in Los Angeles were coming up. So I thought to myself like, oh, this is sort of like, trying to cash out the excitement about the Olympics being in Los Angeles maybe for as well. But yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that. But what about like the bite taken out of the Apple? That definitely signifies something, doesn't it?
I remember hearing, like, I remember specifically, like, someone telling me why there wasn't one Apple. It was probably like my uncle, like, a couple of years ago. I think it has something to do with, like, if you look at something that's whole and then it's trying to be different, or taking part of it, I don't even remember, but I feel like it symbolizes, like, taking part of something away from a whole, trying to, I don't remember, but I know there's a meaning to it.
Yeah, I mean, anyone here like in women's studies? Go ahead.
I've taken women's studies class, but I'm not sure.
Let's think about like Abrahamic religions, the book of Genesis. What does the apple signify?
Adam and Eve in the garden.
Yeah, so who gives what to whom?
Eve gives the apple to Adam.
In the apple signifies what?
Oh, I guess like you have after you eat the apple, you get to see everything.
Right, so knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's definitely sort of like a semiotic meaning, like deeply imbued in Apple's logo. All right, good. So let's look at how ads get made for a bit. So every I'm sorry about the slop notes. The font's different in this Windows system compared to Apple, but you still get the point, hopefully. So there's classical divisions of an ad agency. There's accounts, creative, research, in media. So basically every like ad campaign, normally, not every, I should say, but most campaigns start with a creative brief, which is given from the client to the ad agency. And the creative brief is essentially a document used to outline the strategy of a creative product or project. It contains project details, including the project's purpose, goals, requirements, messaging, demographics, or most recently psychographics, and other key information. It's usually developed in the project initiation phase. A creative brief will help a creative team better understand a project from the start. It might also be presented to key stakeholders and clients. So a good example of a creative brief, I'll show you sort of the ad campaign that came from it, is in the 1960s, Levy's Bread and the Birnbach Agency, which was like a hip hop, like up and coming agency in the 60s, very sort of like progressive. Levy's came to them and wanted them to sort of like expand their market share. Levy's was a really prominent bread company amongst like Hasidic Jewish people, sort of like more modern Jewish people, but they wanted to sort of expand their consumer base. So they employed Buster Keaton, who was a contemporary of Charlie Chaplin, sort of like, you know, a comedic force of the early 20th century silent era all the way through the 20s. You see how sort of like grumpy and sad he is. This is sort of like a joke. Most of the ads that come out look like this. So you can see they're trying to appeal to sort of like different ethnicities, all essentially the same ad, which is sort of like trying to expand their base. So like, what do all of these people except for Buster Keaton have in common? So yeah, go ahead. Howard.
Well, that a mouthful of bread and a smiling.
Yeah, exactly. And like, what can you take away from that?
I guess it tastes good.
Yeah, the bread's making them happy, right? But also I think what's interesting about this is like, it reminds me of the social realism that we looked at in the 1930s, like Depression era ads, where it's just sort of like stark, like straight on photography. Like it's not like the 1920s at all, where it's like super pastel or like rich people consuming things. Like it's, you know, stripped down, austere, but it has happy people in it. So it's sort of like taking that social realism of the 1930s and like putting this sort of twist on it. And it was a really successful campaign. I mean, their market share got a lot better after this campaign. So in World War II, post-World War II ads, you might remember we just sort of like touched on it very briefly before spring break. Ads tended to have romantic depictions of harmonious nuclear families, i.e. white families, traditional families, i.e. white families, and idealized settings like, you know, happily consuming, going on vacation, driving their car, usually in the suburbs. So you get a good sense of it from here, sort of like this nuclear white family all loading into the Studebaker, going on vacation. So this is like a quintessential like 1948 ad to like through 1950s. But in the 1960s, you have this creative revolution. The Beat Generation is taking root all through the 50s into the 60s. There's a real backlash, a counterculture growing to sort of like the IBMs of the world and the sort of like corporate conformity that becomes associated with American life. It's led by Bill Birnbach and David Ogilvy, and they sought to make ads tell the truth as much as I guess ads could tell the truth, be hard hitting and more realistic. So this is Birnbach here. He came out with this really famous ad campaign for Volkswagen, which is of course a German company. So in America, when Volkswagen is first introduced to the market, like what kind of cars are really popular? Do you remember? Go ahead, Howard.
There's like Ford on them.
What's that?
Ford.
Yeah. Julian, did you want to add something?
We're actually just talking about this in one of the classes, and my professor said that they were like big cars. So,
Yeah, exactly.
so
Yeah, so Howard's right. Like American cars in particular, like are really fetishized. Like Ford. What would be like the best car that you could have, if you, like the symbol of having made it in America? Do you remember? Go ahead.
Cadillac.
Yeah, exactly, Cadillac. So Cadillac, you get the sense, especially during this time period, they're like, you know, they're basically like boats, you know, on wheels. And then so Volkswagen, when it enters the market, seems to have a bit of a branding problem, right? Because they're these like little dumpy sort of like ladybug looking cars. They don't really fit like what's the popular aesthetic. So Birnbach tries to take the perceived weakness and turn it into a strength. So it takes like this sort of like, you know, pejorative, like think small, but then in this tells you like why it's so much better, like good gas mileage, you know, things like that, easier to park. This would be like a lemon, which is like, you know, lemon is of course associated with like, you know, a bad car, like something you used car salesman like cheated you into buying. But again, like when you read the fine print, it's like telling you that it's like not at all lemon, even though it looks like a lemon kind of. So, and again, like there's a counterculture that's developing during this time period. And it's going, like, whatever is mainstream and popular, whatever is the opposite of that is going to appeal to a certain subculture of people, like, you know, beatniks or hippies or whatever the case may be. And these cars, of course, become very popular amongst, you know, beatniks and hippies, especially the VW van, which, you know, hippies go traveling around the country in. So it's really brilliant advertising campaign in that context. So another one of the creative revolutionaries of the 1960s is this guy, David Ogilvy. If anybody's seen Mad Men, it's based on this guy, David Ogilvy's, his memoir. Don Draper is essentially based on David Ogilvy. And here's one of Ogilvy's ads where it's just sort of like a boring shirt commercial or shirt ad in like a magazine, but you stick this patch on the guy and all of a sudden it's sort of like, you know, like it just makes you sort of like pay attention to it. It stands out in a way that it wouldn't if he was not wearing the patch. So it's sort of clever in that regard. And I think this is sort of like a, the prologue to that Dos Equis campaign of the most interesting man in the world. Like it sort of like has that vibe to it as well. And again, this is a pretty clever Ogilvy ad for Rolls-Royce. It says the tagline is at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise. This new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock, and this new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock. And of course, what's the sound of an electric clock makes?
Yeah, nothing. Like
Yeah.
their whole point was like the quietest ride.
Exactly, it's like riding on a carpet. So here's Ogilvy's like 11 commandments for creating ads or not agencies, campaigns, I should say. So the first is what you say is more important than how you say it. Unless your campaign's built around a great idea, it will flop. Give the facts. You can't bore people into buying. Be well-mannered, but don't clown. Make your advertising contemporary, which I think the bread ads and the Volkswagen ads are both really good examples of. Committees can criticize advertisements, but they cannot write them. In other words, he's saying that the best way to do ads is to have one person like really absorb themselves in research for the product and just sort of like imbue their own personality through the research that they do rather than having a bunch of people work on it. 8, if you're lucky enough to write a good advertisement, repeat it until it stops. So if any of you are like American football fans, like that whole saying, just keep running the same play until the defense figures out a way to stop you. It's the same sort of like philosophy of this one, just keep sort of sticking to the same thing until it's no longer effective. So never write an advertisement which you wouldn't want your own family to read. I'm not sure how many people follow that credo nowadays. The image of the brand is the most important thing. So no matter how creative your ad is or how sort of sparkling or whatever, you always have to keep it rooted in the sort of ethos of the brand, whether it's Apple or IBM or whatever. And don't be a copycat. This is final rule. So I want to show you a case study of an ad that I think checks all of the boxes that Ogilvy just presented. It's an Old Spice ad. I don't know if anyone sort of like has any familiarity with Old Spice, but all through the 20th century, it's usually associated with elderly gentlemen. Like my grandpa in particular always reeked of Old Spice. He always got it for Christmas for some reason from my grandma, even though he still had 10 bottles in his bathroom. That's another story for another time, I guess. But anyway, the association of Old Spice through the 20th century was that it's like, you know, it's a product for old people. So when you get into the 21st century, like nobody's really buying it anymore. Their market share is really diminished from things like Axe body spray, which is marketed to young people. So their creative brief, which Procter & Gamble, who owns Old Spice, took to Wieden and Kennedy, which is like a hip up and coming ad agency out of Portland who does a lot of work for Nike. They wanted to present the product as being more masculine, and they wanted it to appeal to women consumers in particular. So why would this men's product, why would it be so important to market it to women in particular? Go ahead, Laza.
Because like they try to sell the idea like, oh, if you use this soap, like women will like it more. Like I feel like every single soap, like even now,
Yeah.
every single soap like advertisement
Yeah, will it get you laid?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Like, that's
more
the
or less.
idea.
More or less, but also like starting in the 1920s, who are most ads marketed towards? Like 80%, do you remember? Go ahead. Yeah, exactly. And that doesn't change much through the 20th century into the 21st century. Most ads are, most women still have purchasing power. They do most of the shopping. So yeah, I mean, I think Laszlo and Samantha are both sort of on the right track. So what they come up with is the Smell Like a Man Old Spice campaign. This particular ad is the man your man can smell like. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen it, but I'll show it anyway, and we'll talk about it after.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me. But if he stopped using lady-scented body wash and switched to Old Spice, he could smell like he's me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on a boat. The man your man could smell like. What's in your hand? Back at me. I have it. It's an oyster with 2 tickets to that thing you love. Look again. The tickets are now diamond. Anything is possible when your man smells like Old Spice and not a lady. I'm on a horse.
All right, so what is Old Spice selling other than the body wash and all that? Yeah, go ahead. Lauren, yeah.
They're essentially selling a lifestyle, so they're selling like, the lifestyle that everyone wants, going out on adventures with a man, getting diamonds,
Yeah, the tickets to whatever.
exactly, like the whole perfect relationship is what they're selling.
Yeah.
The perfect man.
Julie, did you want to add to it?
I was gonna say like being a good boyfriend.
Yeah. Being a better boyfriend than your boyfriend actually is, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think they're saying like all starts with like Old Spice. So you start with getting Old Spice, then it leads to becoming more like him, and then that leads to getting the tickets to Twisted Diamonds.
Yeah, exactly. Good. So, did you want to add something?
I was just gonna say, it's like it leads to supposedly a better relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So again, like from a semiotic perspective, there's a bunch sort of like crammed into this that you could take away from it, like in the body wash is like sort of second and all that. So there's 4 like real key things to putting a creative ad into action, which is selecting the right director, taking a script and turning it into an effective spot, shooting the commercial, like all the technical aspects that go into it, and then choosing the right spokesperson. So did you guys think that was the right spokesperson for that? Yeah, I think so as well. Did anyone notice sort of like any technical aspects about the ad that was, interesting? Go ahead, Samantha.
By technical, do you mean like how the.
Just how it was shot, how.
It seemed like it was all done in one shot. and
Yeah.
the green screen, and, it was like magic. Like this man is so perfect that he's literally like appearing, it's like transporting to these places and making Old Spice bottles appear out of nowhere.
Yeah, go ahead, Howard.
I feel like it also didn't do too much. 'Cause if sometimes people tend to like do too much, you kind of lose interest in your viewer. I feel like all of us just watching the whole thing. Like you didn't do a lot, like how to get to this point, and that was it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. We'll come back to that. Go ahead.
The transitions are like very smooth and it was like quick and he's talking the whole time, keeping me engaged. So like it was pretty good. And it was a quick commercial. It was only like
30 seconds.
Yeah, it conveyed so much in that 30 seconds. Did you want to add something?
No, I was just gonna say that it's like it's good value for 30-second ad. Obviously.
Yeah.
Stack with everything.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, and again, like pointing out the importance of a director, had it been a different director, like it could have been a completely different ad. Like, and yeah, like it seemed like it was shot on a green screen, but actually it was like this whole like set design that was built. The guy's just sitting on like a fake horse the whole time, and like there's like crew behind the scenes like pulling this whole like stage as it goes by. So if you have like a different sort of like set design team, a different director, it could have been a completely different ad. But what about the getting back to Howard's point about like, did you notice where was the actor's gaze? What's he looking at throughout it? Go ahead.
I think it was just the camera.
Yeah, so you, right?
Yeah.
So he's breaking that 4th wall, and I think that's part of like what Howard's getting onto as well about like ads really have to like grab you by the throat, right, from Jump Street, because like in the day of the internet in particular, it doesn't like really sort of like reach into your soul and grab you, like you're just sort of going to the next thing. Go ahead, Parker.
Yeah, and it's also like telling you what to do. Like, he's telling you to look at your boyfriend in the back. Like that keeps you engaged.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, and I think this is a good example of like the early sort of advent of internet advertising where it really has to grab you in the first 5 seconds, or it's just not grabbing you at all. All right, so again, I can't really underscore the importance of research. Ogilvy, points out the importance of research. The more research goes into an advertisement, the more sort of captivating it's going to be. Same thing with a research paper. So we go from demographics to psychographics through the 20th century, especially once cable television becomes like so prominent in the 70s and 80s. Ads get much more sort of diverse as a result. So you might recall that before World War II, ads are mostly focused on demographics, things like race, class, gender, religion, ethnicity. But as we get through the Cold War period into the 70s and 80s, as I said, like cable channels proliferate. So there's like new TV shows, new TV channels for everyone, like ESPN, MTV, things like that. That makes the look of ads change too. And ads are increasingly geared towards psychographics rather than demographics. And what we mean by psychographics is like trying to appeal to a person's values, their lifestyle, their outlook on life, things like that. So Bill Barr, he does a good job of, anybody recognize the name Bill Barr? William Barr, O'Barr, I should say. Yeah, the first reading we had this semester was O'Barr reading, and then we'll have another one on subliminal advertising that's written by Barr. He's a professor at Duke, and he comes up, he's one of like the forerunners, the creators of this VAL system. So this is an 11-minute video, so sort of like long and involved, but he does a really good job of explaining what the different VALs are, and he shows you specific ads geared towards like the different sort of like VAL groups that he identifies. So pay good close attention to this. On the exam, there'll be like, questions that ask you to sort of like connect the VAL system to the ads that you're being shown. So let's get into this.
Is one of the systems that is perhaps best known. It's what's known as the VALS system. And here is the chart they use to show the different categories that they divide the world up into. You'll see that in this case, dividing the American world up produces a set of categories that are not at all like the demographic ones I described before. There's no 18 to 35-year-old men, but rather categories that people will call things like thinkers, achievers, experiencers, and so on. Now, these categories are distinguished from one another along a couple of dimensions. First of all, they're distinguished by the things that motivate them. And you'll see that there are some who are listed under being very idealistic, some who are achievement-oriented, some who are concerned about self-expression. And there are then other distinctions that are important here, and this is the issue of the level of resources available to people to buy things in the marketplace. There's some people with a lot of resources, and there's some people with much more limited ones. And so what you'll see here in the main categories in the center is the idealistic versus the achievement interested people versus the self-expression folks are divided further into the categories of those who have more resources to spend and those who are more limited in their budgets and how fully they can participate in the consumer experience. I'd like to show you now how we can look at each of these categories and see how it can be connected to the way our commercial is constructed and the way that consumers are talked to. Let's begin with the category that's called thinkers in the VAL system. These are people who are motivated highly by ideas. They tend to be well educated. They tend to work in professional occupations. They are content with their careers, their families, their station in life. They are highly informed about the world and about national events. And they are concerned about such things as functionality, value, durability of products, and so forth. Now, in thinking about what kind of items, what kind of categories these people might be interested in, we can look at a car ad that is written really thinking about people like this. So I'd like you to watch the following ad, and I think you can see in it how these issues about the way that these folks called thinkers look at the world are reflected in what's said in this television commercial.
It's not that easy. spend each day the color of the leaves. But when I think it could be nicer, being red or yellow or gold, it's not that easy being green. I guess it is easy being green. The 36 mile per gallon Ford Escape Hybrid.
All right, so if that commercial appealed to you, what do you think your voting preferences would be? Conservative or liberal? Liberal, yeah, I agree. Yeah. People who believe in global warming.
Believers, by contrast to the ones we just considered the thinkers, are conservative folks who are fairly conventional. They tend to value family, religion, community, and nation. They're very predictable in their behavior, very loyal to brands. These are the folks who go out of their way to buy American products whenever possible. And they respond to the linkage of brands to fundamental American values. And you can see all these things happening in the next commercial, where these traditional values, the Americanness and so forth, are played up in terms of the way the commercial is constructed.
Is our country.
So voters of that commercial, conservative, liberal? Conservative, yeah, but like what's interesting to me about that is that there's also like footage of Muhammad Ali in that, who was like highly vilified for refusing to join the armed forces during the Vietnam War. History has since vindicated him, of course. There's also pictures of like people dancing at like Woodstock and things like that as well. So this might appeal to people who vote conservative, but like they may have been part of the counterculture at one point.
Now, all that stands in contrast to yet another group of people who are referred to in the VOW system as achievers. These are people who are motivated by the desire to achieve. They tend to be highly successful people. They work because it's a sense of duty to them, but it also provides material rewards and prestige. These folks value predictability. They like to buy reliable, durable, stylish products. And they like brands especially that reflect their level of achievement. And you can see that also in the following television commercial, that this is an ad directed to people who are very concerned with the brand that will reflect the fact that they are people who have achieved things in their lives. And those achievements include financial resources that allow them to buy more expensive cars that reflect, again, their sense of who they are.
We've never looked back, never stopped pushing forward. Because the race that really matters, the race with ourselves, is never over.
One of the interesting things about this ad is that it could appeal to someone with like $35,000, $40,000 to spend on a Mercedes, but also like the vintage ones that were being advertised in it could be like sold for like $1 million, $2 million. So it's like a wide, sort of net they're casting on who they're marketing to, even though it tends to be skewed towards the upper class.
The strivers are people who also seek to achieve, but they place a very heavy emphasis on the opinion and approval of other people. These folks often lack self-confidence. They look to brands to help define themselves and help them fit into society. They buy expensive items if they can afford them, but they often settle for lower budget alternatives. And they frequently end up saving money for expensive items. So you can see that happening in the following commercial where expense is a factor, what other people will think about you when you own this particular kind of car. But the fact is that owning it is still a mark of a sense of achievement for the person who was the owner.
Introducing the totally new Jeep Compass for just $15,995.
Contrasting with these earlier categories are further ones, including experiences. These are people who seek variety and wide experiences in their lives. They are the folks who favor the offbeat and risky. They're avid consumers. They like to buy things, to own things. And they often buy things on the basis of whims, appearance, and trendiness. And if you look at the following commercial, you'll see that that's exactly what's being talked about here. That this is something different. This is something that is risky a bit, and it's certainly different from the usual. So here is a commercial directed to experiencers. And by contrast to all of this, we can see a category of the valve system referred to as makers. These are people who enjoy do-it-yourself projects. They tend to be self-sufficient and practical folks. They demand and buy safe and reliable products. They're always looking for good quality at lower prices. The men in this category are interested in cars and repairing their cars, taking care of them, doing projects around the house. And the women may be interested in things like cooking, sewing, household projects, and so forth. These are the makers who do things. And you can see this illustrated in this print ad where this man is working with tools he bought at Lowe's on his car in his home garage. And this is what he likes to do. This is the kind of person he is. And these kinds of folks, again, standing in contrast to some of the other categories, markedly in terms of how they look at the world. These folks are appealed to through projects and categories like this.
But again, like that could be the makers category, could be someone who's wealthy, like someone who'd buy that $1 million Mercedes, but also sort of someone who's blue collar. So again, like this valve system is like appealing to like multiple classes, races, ethnicities all at once. It's not like locking you into this demographic sort of identity.
Now, the system also includes two other categories of people. One of them are the innovators and the other are the survivors. And they contrast remarkably with one another because the innovators are the highly successful people who are in control of their lives. They have abundant resources. They spend lots of money and they buy expensive items that reflect their personal lifestyles. And on the other end of the continuum are survivors. These are people who really are on severely restricted low budgets, who must shop for the least expensive products and brands they can afford. These are the folks who go especially to places like Walmart, who really seek value for money, and often don't have much of it to spend. Now, sadly, in terms of the way all these things work in a consumer-oriented society, is these people are often typically ignored by advertisers for the simple reason that they don't have much money and therefore not much clout in the marketplace. On the other hand, the innovators have a lot. They have a lot of money to spend and they are much sought after as consumers because of their ability to expend their resources. So these are outliers, but one in one direction,
Yeah,
one
so
in the other.
at the extremes, essentially, of the survivors, like the Walmart shoppers, et cetera, versus the innovators. So where would the innovators shop? Well, like what products would they buy? Yeah, like Rolex, Rolls Royce, things like that, like things that like only like a very, the 99% or the 1%, I should say, would be able to buy. So the two major questions, regardless of whether you're advertising to the survivors or the innovators, is do consumers remember the ad, and does the ad persuade, i.e. manipulate the consumer to buy? So like out of those value systems, what do you think like the average like college kid would be? Like what category would they fall into? Yeah,
Probably survive.
yeah, survivor, anything else? I would say probably, go ahead.
I was gonna say the one where they, said like buy expensive things, they can avoid it, saving up for expensive items.
Yeah, depending on the socioeconomic status of your parents, whether you got a scholarship, things like that. I think that would all play into it. But yeah, I would say like the strivers or the survivors, probably most college students would be. But again, the importance of this VAL system is like consumers aren't locked into this like one category. They're like Venn diagrams, and there's all this overlapping shades of gray. And that's what's so effective about the VAL system of marketing. So again, the most important thing for ads is that it cuts through the morass of the market. So say you go into Whole Foods, you're confronted with an aisle that looks like this. That ad that you may have seen last week or last month, like hopefully, like if the ad was effective, it'll subconsciously influence you or consciously influence you to like see like, oh, I remember something positive about this, so I'm gonna get this as opposed to something over there like the Oreos or whatever. And if it can increase your chance of buying the product and when you're in this setting by like 2 or 3%, the ad's been really effective, you know? All right, so let's look at the process of researching and writing your paper. So the first thing you need to do when you're crafting a paper is you need to pick a topic that genuinely interests you, perhaps within the realm of your major, whatever your major may be, and focus the topic as much as you can. So before you start doing research, it's good to create a research question so that as you're going through the process of looking for primary and secondary sources, you're not just sort of like wandering through the wilderness without a flashlight. And the sooner you come up with a research question, the sooner you can start looking for primary and secondary sources, the better off you'll be, the better your paper will be, the more time you'll have to rewrite. Of course, like 90% of writing is rewriting. So you want to leave yourself plenty of time to really fine tune things, to connect the dots. The more you rewrite, the more you're sort of like making yourself understand your topic. So just some examples of what some research questions could possibly be. Does sex actually sell? There's tons of research available on that, tons of ads that you can look at as far as that's concerned. Are we being manipulated ads? If so, is that a good or a bad thing? William Barr will read an article by Bill Barr later on in the semester that approaches that very topic, as well as does sex sell. Another just example that I came up with off the top of my head was Roland Marchand pointed out grotesque modern in ads of 1930s. Is grotesque modern still prominent in ads in the 21st century? Or another way that you could skin that cat would be to ask, could ads in the 20th century be considered grotesque postmodern? So what you would need to do is like define what we mean by postmodern, or postmodern, and sort of like look to see if there's been a change from Marchand's notion of grotesque modern to grotesque postmodern. That would be, I think, a really effective research paper. So again, your primary source assignments due just about 3 weeks on 4/7. You'll be asked to provide your research question, so you'll need to come up with that by then. Provide cited primary sources, including where they were located, i.e. what archive, and annotate them. And what I mean by annotate them is explain how they're useful to exploring your research topic. Like if you're writing a paper about, grotesque modern and you're, giving me an ad of like the Coca-Cola polar bear, like that's it's not going to be really effective. Definitely not scored too high. So by the 4/14, your secondary source assignment will be due. You'll need to provide your thesis statement. So again, you'll have done plenty of research, enough to take your research question and turn it into a statement, right? A thesis statement. You'll include secondary sources and annotate them. And again, what I mean by annotate is explain how they're useful to your argument. You can find sources that disagree with you or you argue against, or you can either agree with the sources, say like source A, I agrees with me or I agree with it, or you could find something that you disagree with. Like really what being a professional scholar is like writing papers or books or whatever, and presenting a thesis statement. You're basically setting yourself up as a straw man for other people to come along and like beat the shit out of you for like presenting that thesis statement. That's just the game. So if you can find sources that you want to argue against, that's what this thing's all about, you know? So again, you're in conversation with other scholars. Some you might agree with, others might not. Either way is fine. So let's look at some sources for a bit. Duke's Hartman Library has a lot of really good primary sources. I used the Hartman Library a lot on my dissertation, in fact. It doesn't really tend to be too focused on ads post-Cold War. It has a lot of good stuff if you're focusing on the early 20th century through 1920s. Like my dissertation, I focused on the 1890s through 1920s, so it was really useful for me. But you can also find a lot of secondary sources in here. Again, just spend some time sort of like perusing through here. Has anyone had a chance to like think of a topic that they might like to explore? Go ahead, Samantha.
I was looking at how, I can't decide between modern ads or older ads, but that's ads as a form of social emotional manipulation.
All right, so let's just punch that in here and see if we can find anything. Ads as a form of social manipulation.
Emotional.
Oh, emotional, sorry.
It's like, I mean, I guess it could be social.
Yeah,
manipulation, too.
either way. All right, so yeah, I mean, there's some stuff. So you can see how it's like organized and refined. So there's articles, books and media, websites, things like that. But I think JSTOR is really an incredible source. Like if we pay tuition, I mean, just personally speaking, I think JSTOR is worth the price of admission. If you're really into scholarship and doing research, it gives you access to literally like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of academic articles that if you were just buying it out on the open market, like it would cost you like 50 bucks a pop, 100 bucks a pop, things like that. You can see if you just punch in here, you can do all content or just focus on images. If you focus on this part right here, when you go to the link, this will predominantly take you to secondary sources, but also primary sources. We just want to focus on primary sources, scroll down a bit and do browse by collection. So let's see, like, does sex sell? Let's see what we can come up with just in terms of primary sources. These have secondary sources as well. Yeah, so here's like current projects for the most part. So this would be like the latest scholarship on it. If you just go to like images and do does sex sell. It'll take you to like all kinds of old stuff, and then like you can just sort of like go through the years, like generation by generation. Does sex sell in the 21st century? So again, just poke around in this as much as possible. Whenever you get a chance, like the sooner you settle on your topic, like the more time you'll have to research, obviously. Let's look at secondary sources. So again, it's just chock full of things. The more you refine your search, like the better off you'll be. Does sex sell is obviously a really big topic. So anyone else have any ideas about what they might pursue? Go ahead, Faith.
I know you've talked about Nightmare Alley multiple times. I don't exactly remember what you talked about with that. That just brings me to the topic of movies and maybe the idea of how successful movie trailers are.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure how you would go about quantifying it. Let's punch it in and see what we can find. So, Yeah, so you can see like, and again, like going through this process of like coming up with research questions and seeing like what sources are available to you, it will help you refine and like focus your topic even more. So again, like, has anyone been in JSTOR in like other classes or anything like that? This is your first time using JSTOR for the most part? No? Yeah, it's really, really useful, really sort of like incredible. And what's on March 23rd, we're gonna visit Drew's archive, and Candace over there will sort of give you a primer on how to most effectively use these databases and whatever databases Drew has available to it. Any other topics? No? So yeah, as soon as you can, start thinking on the topics. Like again, like these projects come up really thick and fast. The first one's due in just less than 3 weeks. And the point of the primary source project, the secondary source project, they're like building blocks to get to sort of like connect all of these dots, to put these things together, so that when the 28th rolls around, like you've already sort of like been marinating on this stuff, thinking about it, hopefully rewriting many times. Yeah, so again, I'm always happy to, you know, bounce ideas back and forth with you. Got my email, my office hours, of course, doors always open if you need to come and see me for anything. So I think we've done enough for today. Again, just the last thought I want to leave you with is get thinking on these paper topics as soon as you can. All right, see you guys. Have a happy St. Day.
Thank you.
Somebody gonna go hang out with her? Huh? Let me hope so. So far. Good. All right, so trying to think like on topic, her topic, which is those are more like.
So nice.
Yeah, I mean, like a good, someone asked about like sports in my last class, like that was, he had like a really sort of like, I want to write about something like sports. So I mean, to narrow the topic would be like, what do the meaning, what would be the meaning of like Air Jordan ads in the 80s and 90s? What does that sort of like illuminate about changes in like larger American society or something like that? So yeah, I mean, like just sort of like try to make it like narrow in terms of like discovering like what the historical importance is of like ad campaigns or like specific ads, or like even like, you know, after Laura Ingraham at Fox News said that LeBron James should just shut up and dribble, he started coming out with like all these overtly political ads after that.
Yeah.
And sort of like response to that, that might be an interesting thing to explore as well.
Okay,
So,
that helps me a lot there.
yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So anytime you come up with any type of ideas, just sort of like, you know, I'm happy to bounce them off.
Okay,
Just like,
great. Thank you, Professor.
No problem.
Have a good weekend.
You too.